Hi, my name is Sol Soler, and this is The Truth About Quantum Mechanics and Consciousness. Abstract. In this essay, I will explain to you the truth about quantum mechanics and consciousness. I will give the first simple, logical, and intuitive interpretation of the experimental results of the branch of physics known as quantum mechanics. I will also solve what is known as the hard problem of consciousness, which states, how are we conscious if the basic energy and particles out of which we are formed are all individually devoid of any consciousness whatsoever? The truth is that the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics quite immediately solves the hard problem of consciousness. You see, the hard problem of consciousness hides an implicit fallacy. This fallacy is the a priori assumption that the basic energy and particles of our universe are totally devoid of any conscious perceptions and abilities. The truth is that this ancient assumption, and it is only an assumption, is wrong. There exist two and only two logical possibilities with respect to the origin of consciousness. Either one, consciousness came into existence sometime after t equals 0. Which is to say, sometime after the Big Bang. Then the basic energy and particles of our universe are devoid of consciousness, and consciousness somehow switches on around complex configurations of the non-conscious energy and particles, such as the human brain. That's one possibility, known as the theory of emergent consciousness, and to date, it is the only type of theory that has received any serious scientific consideration. After a full century at least of pursuing only this way of thinking, there is still not even the beginnings of a sensible emergent theory of consciousness. The mystery of consciousness remains pristine. These many decades of non-results strongly motivate the serious consideration of the only remaining logical possibility. Possibility 2. Consciousness came into existence at t equals 0, at the very same moment as the Big Bang. And all the basic energy of our universe is in fact conscious, is in fact physical consciousness, and E equals C, that is capital E equals capital C, where capital E is energy and capital C is consciousness. Over the course of this essay, I will show you how this new postulate simply and beautifully solves the twin mysteries of quantum mechanics and consciousness. And do listen to the end of the essay, where I will correctly interpret 4 of the most famous experiments of quantum mechanics. Okay, let's begin. Our modern scientific understanding of our universe is undeniably impressive and expansive. However, it contains one glaring and fundamental gap, the importance of which is really impossible to overstate. That gap is consciousness. All science and philosophy, all theorizing and reflection of any kind is carried out entirely through consciousness. Indeed, all of human life and all the meaning derived from human life has consciousness as its foundational phenomenon. If consciousness didn't exist, then neither would you. And even to ask or ponder the question, what is consciousness, is itself a conscious act. So it isn't hyperbole to say that with no understanding of consciousness, there can be no real understanding of ourselves, our universe, and our place within it. And as far as modern science is concerned, consciousness remains a total mystery. There is a technical name for the mystery of consciousness. It's known as the hard problem of consciousness. It's a very old and well-known problem that asks the very reasonable question: how are you conscious if all the basic energy and particles that make up your body and brain possess no consciousness at all? From a scientific point of view, a human being, or any conscious entity, is a physical object, and everything contained in it, all your organs and cells and brain cells, are all made up of nothing except for the 3 kinds of basic subatomic particles: protons, neutrons, and electrons, along with some energy content. As you already know, protons and neutrons can be broken down into even smaller particles, such as quarks. But since quarks are also believed to be devoid of any consciousness, that doesn't affect our argument. So we have the scientific fact that the body and brain are made up of only protons, neutrons, and electrons, and energy. The hard problem of consciousness is created by this fact in combination with another assumed scientific fact, namely that the basic energy in particles, such as protons, neutrons, and electrons, are totally devoid of any conscious perceptions and abilities. But it's very important to note that this second fact isn't actually a fact. It's an assumption. It has just been assumed for centuries because the behavior of particles like protons, neutrons, and electrons hasn't appeared as conscious behavior to the human scientists studying them. And over the course of this essay, I will prove beyond any reasonable doubt that it is an incorrect assumption. For the moment, just make sure you understand exactly what the hard problem of consciousness is. Humans are made of nothing but protons, neutrons, and electrons, and energy. And these basic particles and energy are believed to be totally devoid of any consciousness, which immediately begs the question, how are we conscious? Scientists and philosophers have been trying to answer the hard problem of consciousness for literal centuries, and the mystery remains pristine. Of course, many different answers have been suggested, but none of them has made enough sense to convince people that it's correct. The main way scientists have tried to answer this question is by what are known as emergent theories of consciousness. All emergent theories of consciousness assume a priori that all the basic energy and particles of our universe are non-conscious, but that they can come together into special configurations, such as your brain, for example, within or around which consciousness somehow discontinuously switches on. The problem is that even after a full century of pursuing only this line of thinking, there still doesn't exist even the beginnings of a remotely comprehensible theory as to how consciousness switches on around non-conscious constituents. You can check for yourself. Sir Roger Penrose is a very great physicist, as well as the world's second most expert on consciousness. And you can watch him on the Joe Rogan show admitting that consciousness is still a total scientific mystery. He hopes that the answer will somehow be found in physical structures called microtubules. However, just like neurons, where scientists previously thought the answer lay, microtubules are made of only energy and proton, neutrons, and electrons, and like them are thought to be individually devoid of any consciousness. Sir Roger Penrose thinks the answer is connected to microtubules and quantum mechanics. And he's half right. The solution to the mystery of consciousness is intimately related to quantum mechanics, but it has nothing to do with microtubules. See for yourself if you can find an emergent theory of consciousness that makes any sense to you. You'll find a lot of talk about neurons and neural networks and feedback loops, but you won't find an intelligible theory as to how consciousness switches on around configurations of totally non-conscious constituents. Then there are other, more far-fetched theories of consciousness, such as your brain being an antenna for consciousness, and your consciousness is being broadcast like a radio signal from some kind of source consciousness radio station. There are a couple of problems with this theory. One, we've been scanning space for decades and we've never found any evidence for any supposed consciousness broadcasting. And two, this theory would suggest that there would sometimes be breaks or interference in the signal. And we know that lead greatly reduces the intensity of even very high frequency radiation. And yet a human enclosed within several feet of lead experiences no interference whatsoever in their conscious experience, suggesting that their consciousness is being generated by their body and brain itself. So then, to maintain this theory, you're forced to say that consciousness is some different kind of non-detectable, scientifically unobservable radiation, which then obviously makes a scientific theory of consciousness impossible. It's a creative idea, but from a strictly scientific point of view, it's not much better than nonsense. And yet, it's not the most absurd theory of consciousness the modern world entertains. Since, given the relentless failure of emergent theories to offer any insight into the nature of consciousness, a large and ever-growing number of theorists are seriously suggesting that consciousness doesn't exist. The fact that they have only come to this conclusion after long periods of time consciously reflecting on the problem, and that they can only offer their theories through some form of conscious communication, not to mention that just like you, they spend all day every day consciously seeing, hearing, thinking and feeling things, seems to have escaped their attention. Hilariously absurd. The only reason the question "what is consciousness" has ever arisen is because we are fundamentally conscious entities. It is only through consciousness that we know that we or anything at all exists. But anyway, as I explain my very simple theory, these alternatives will become more and more apparently absurd in contrast. By now, the astute among you have likely discerned the basics of my theory and how it solves the hard problem of consciousness. The assumption that all the basic energy and particles of our universe are non-conscious is incorrect. So we will change this assumption, or in technical scientific language, we will change this postulate to the correct postulate, which we will call the postulate of fundamental consciousness, and which states: all the physical energy and matter, particles, quarks, strings, etc. of this universe are conscious, are in fact different formations of physical consciousness, are in fact the physical manifestations of pure consciousness. Now, this is a revolutionary idea, but it is not an absurd or illogical or woo-woo idea. It's at least as reasonable as postulating that consciousness somehow discontinuously switches on around non-conscious particles, and that the universe existed for billions of years devoid of any experience whatsoever until what we call life eventually emerged. Which would mean that for those 10 billion years or so before life emerged, that the existence of the universe was pragmatically equivalent to non-existence. Anyway, as we progress, you'll see for yourself just how logical, powerful and fruitful our new postulate is in explaining the nature of our conscious experience. Firstly, it quite immediately solves the hard problem of consciousness. How are you conscious? Well, physical consciousness, or conscious energy, came into existence in the Big Bang event, and this conscious energy evolved in the various ways that have been objectively described in conventional physics, including the creation of the basic particles. And of course, these particles, being formed out of nothing but conscious energy, are themselves conscious. And these basic conscious particles are capable of bonding together into more complex formations of conscious energy, such as atoms and molecules, etc. Then, through the various processes of chemical and biological evolution that have been objectively described by conventional science, formations of conscious energy and particles as complex as human beings formed, at least here on Earth. Formations of conscious energy so complex that they are capable of inquiring and reflecting on the nature of their own consciousness. So, every particle in your body is conscious, and they have bonded together to form a single physical object that is giving rise within itself to exactly your private, personal, subjective conscious experience. Now, that's just the briefest of sketches of the theory that we will now proceed to put on a rigorously scientific footing, and which we will put beyond all reasonable doubt by proving that the branch of physics known as quantum mechanics is actually physical evidence of the postulate of fundamental consciousness. We will do this by using the postulate of fundamental consciousness to give the first logical, sensible, and intuitive interpretation of the experimental results of quantum mechanics, an interpretation that has long been lacking from this famously confusing and misunderstood branch of physics. Okay, So that's the plan. Let me recap a little bit, just so I want to be totally clear. So I'm going to recap all the major points, so that so that I'm sure you're following my argument. So number one, for centuries, scientists have assumed that the basic energy and particles of our universe are devoid of consciousness. 2. This assumption immediately begs the question, how are we conscious when we're made of nothing but these non-conscious constituents? 3. Throughout decades, if not centuries, scientists have totally failed to come up with any sensible answer to this question. 4. So now we will try a new assumption, namely the postulate of fundamental consciousness. All the energy born in the Big Bang, and thus all the particles formed out of it, are and always have been conscious. 5. This new postulate solves the hard problem of consciousness, and we will also use it to begin the development of a true physics of consciousness. And finally, 6. To prove the validity of our new postulate, we will use it to provide the first sensible interpretation of the experiments of quantum mechanics, the branch of physics famous for not having a sensible interpretation. Okay, so that's to recap. But just before we do that, I'm going to draw a very strong analogy to Copernicus and the revolution he brought about concerning our solar system. Just like me, Copernicus only changed one assumption or postulate of physics. Copernicus changed the fundamental postulate of the solar system. Before Copernicus, everyone believed that the Earth is at the center of the solar system, a belief known as geocentrism. And all the measurements of the motions of the other planets and the Sun across the sky were being explained by first assuming geocentrism. Now, since this assumption is incorrect, the pre-Copernican model of the solar system, called the Ptolemaic model, is convoluted and inelegant to the point of being ridiculous. Check out the Ptolemaic model of the solar system for yourself. It's ungainly, to say the least. But Copernicus's new postulate of heliocentrism, putting the Sun at the center, transformed our picture of our solar system into the beautifully simple series of ellipses around the Sun that we're all familiar with. Of course, back then the existing scientific establishment aggressively rejected Copernicus's new theory, not because he was wrong, obviously, but rather because he threatened their worldview. It was considered blasphemy to suggest the Earth wasn't the center of the universe. Also, his theory naturally required a large reconceptualization of the universe they inhabited. To go from the center of the universe to third rock from the Sun is the hell of a shift, especially if you'd spent your whole life living with and teaching geocentrism. Similarly, a lot of scientists are initially going to reflexively reject my theory, but not because it's wrong or illogical, but because it threatens them. The symmetry, or maybe better anti-symmetry, is really quite beautiful. Where Copernicus was rejected for threatening the establishment's faith in God, my theory will be initially rejected for threatening the modern scientific establishment's faith in atheism. But be sure to pay attention to just how they reject me. It will never be on any logical grounds. They'll just reflexively call it nonsense, and when I point out the nonsensical aspects of their theories, they'll tend to ignore me or to resort to insisting that consciousness doesn't exist, which is really the only possible refutation of my theory. But if you're consciously hearing my words, then you know that consciousness does exist, at least your own. I'm compiling a collection of their written attempts to refute me in a blog titled Responses to Simplicio, which will very clearly reveal the paucity of their arguments, as well as allow me to develop my theory in more detail. But now, this is exciting. Now I'm delighted to tell you about a new physical law of our universe. We will use this law of consciousness in conjunction with our already stated postulate of fundamental consciousness to sensibly interpret quantum mechanics and to begin to develop a true physics of consciousness. A few words on the nature of physical law. We all have to obey the physical laws of our universe, whether we have acknowledged their existence or not. Gravity existed long before Isaac Newton. And our universe never directly tells us the laws, nor are they ever directly decreed by God, him plus herself. For a physical law to be explicitly stated, it has to first be deduced by a mere human. Not only that, but even our laws of the universe are in the last analysis only provisional, and as our intelligence and experience of our universe expands, our laws may be subject to change or modification. So, for example, Newton's law of gravity isn't actually exactly correct, and it was modified by Einstein in his general theory of relativity. Newton's law is a very accurate approximation to the force of gravity, so accurate that for centuries until Einstein it was believed to be exact. However, in some cases it needs to be corrected by Einstein's theory, such as in the case of what's known as the perihelion of Mercury. And it's very likely, inevitable really, that if and when we develop a quantum theory of gravity, it will involve some modification of Einstein's theory of gravity. So our physical laws are not really eternal. They are linguistic and mathematical best approximations to the nature of our universe. Not only that, but they can always be doubted. Take, for example, the law of conservation of energy. Every experiment involving energy measurements ever carried out has verified this law. However, our scientific understanding of our universe is far from complete. As such, it's logically possible, if very unlikely, that there are physical conditions yet to be discovered, or physical regions of the universe yet to be discovered, under which or within which the law of conservation of energy is violated. And as the great Scottish philosopher David Hume pointed out, just because the universe has behaved in one way for a long time is no logical guarantee that it will definitely continue to do so. So, for a far-fetched example, our scientific understanding of the universe is incomplete. So there could be some as yet undiscovered physical theory that shows that the universal gravitational force is about to invert from an attractive force to a repulsive force, at which point we will all start to quite swiftly accelerate into space. Now, this obviously seems extremely unlikely. I'm certainly not losing any sleep over this possibility, but it is a logical possibility. All of this is just to say that our laws of physics are in fact provisional, open to doubt, and all too human. And since human brains are very finite, very small subsets of a very large and very complicated universe, our understanding of our universe will inevitably always be provisional and incomplete. But this doesn't mean it can't continue expanding and becoming more accurate, which possibility motivates the study of physics. So our laws of physics are deduced by mere humans based on prolonged, careful observation of and reflection on the behavior of their universe around them. With all that being said, I now state what I have called the law of privacy of consciousness, the most important of my 6 laws of consciousness. The law of privacy of consciousness states that conscious experience is private to the entity experiencing it. Another way of stating this law is to say that conscious experience cannot be objectively observed. Or a third equivalent statement is that consciousness is a purely subjective phenomenon. Credit where credit is due. I must say that the philosopher Immanuel Kant anticipated this law a few centuries before me when he spoke of the nature of what he called the thing in itself. observing that no matter how much we study any given physical object, what it is to actually be that object, whatever that object may be experiencing within itself, remains a total mystery. That is, unless the object happens to be capable of successfully communicating its inner conscious experience through body language or speech, etc. But even then, they could be lying, or you could misinterpret their communication, and thus their personal subjective conscious experience is always inevitably somewhat mysterious. The law of privacy of consciousness has also been implicitly acknowledged in countless philosophical thought experiments concerning what is known as solipsism. Solipsism is the logical possibility that you are the only person or creature that actually exists and is really conscious. You see, you can be sure you're conscious because you are consciously hearing my words, and you spend all day, every day, consciously seeing, hearing, feeling, and thinking things, as well as making conscious decisions. But you never, ever see or experience anyone else's conscious experience, and nor will you ever experience anyone else's conscious experience. It's impossible. It's impossible the same way it's impossible to travel faster than the speed of light. You can only ever directly observe the outermost layer of another human and infer that they are conscious based on their movements, actions, and speech, etc. And even when we open up a patient's head and directly look within their brains, or use modern brain scanning technologies to directly observe the functioning of their brain, we can only ever see groups of neurons and networks of neurons, that is, their objective physical brain. But we can never see the actual subjective conscious experience that the patient is experiencing within themselves. This fact of the law of privacy of consciousness has led to the creation of a number of philosophical thought experiments that prove that it's logically possible that your consciousness is the only consciousness that really exists. The people around you could be figments of your imagination or programs in a matrix. There is no way of objectively proving beyond all doubt that this isn't the case. Why? Because there is no way to directly, objectively observe consciousness due to the law of privacy of consciousness. It is ignorance of the law of privacy of consciousness that has made a scientific treatment of consciousness so elusive. Conventional objective physics has been so successful in describing our universe that scientists expect every phenomenon to be explicable by way of objective analysis. However, with respect to consciousness, this is not possible because consciousness is a totally subjective phenomenon, and it's impossible to objectively analyze a purely subjective phenomenon. To know the exact nature of a particular conscious experience, you have to be the physical subject generating and experiencing it. The law of privacy has already actually been acknowledged in modern science, though, in what is known as the Turing test, where an AI, an artificial intelligence, is deemed to possess genuine intelligence based solely on the subjective judgment of a human interlocutor. Since intelligence is a function of consciousness, it is therefore a purely subjective phenomenon, and as such can only be recognized subjectively, as a Turing test acknowledges. It is our inability to objectively observe consciousness that allows modern scientists to deny that consciousness exists at all. Of course, if they allowed for subjective evidence of consciousness, they could just ask themselves, as a subject of consciousness, am I conscious? And get immediate subjective confirmation of their own consciousness from themselves. Okay, however, despite all these possible theoretical doubts about the existence of consciousness, deep down you know that you, as well as all the people and animals that make up your life, are conscious. Check now. Ask yourself, am I conscious? Did you not just consciously put that question to yourself? Then you're conscious. And did you not immediately answer yourself in the affirmative? Don't you know that you're conscious? And then think about someone you love, and it can be your dog if you're a misanthrope. Don't you know your dog is conscious? Do you really actually believe that your mom or your dog might be a program in a matrix? I don't think that you really do. I think that while it is impossible to objectively prove that consciousness exists, I think that subjectively you know that it does, because you are consciously pondering the question. And you know that the people around you are conscious based on your interactions with them. At least that's how you're living every single day of your life. The reason I'm dwelling on this point is because my theory of consciousness is so simple and logical that the only way to deny it is to deny that consciousness exists at all. But the people who make this absurd claim are betrayed by how they live their lives, because just like you, they live their entire lives taking for granted that the people around them, their families, loved ones and colleagues, etc., are conscious. Okay, so my theory assumes consciousness exists. I think that's a pretty reasonable postulate, given that all science and physics and theorizing of any kind has been carried out exclusively by conscious human beings through their consciousness. My theory also postulates that physical energy and matter exist. This is the very most basic postulate of all science, but I've even encountered scientists prepared to deny that energy and matter exist as a last resort in denying my theory. And then, as I've already stated, the postulate of fundamental consciousness, that all basic energy and matter possess some intrinsic consciousness. And finally, the law of privacy of consciousness, that says that all conscious experience is private to the physical object generating and experiencing it. So those are the basic postulates of my theory. Very simple and reasonable postulates. And we will use them now to very simply and reasonably interpret the experiments of quantum mechanics. And you'll see that my interpretation isn't really all that much stranger or radically different from the conventional theory. So let's very briefly state the conventional theory as it's taught in universities around the world. The conventional theory. Physical energy came into existence. So this is the conventional theory of consciousness and how a human exists and is conscious, starting with the beginning of the universe. And put very briefly. So conventional theory, physical energy came into existence in the Big Bang, and it was and remains devoid of any consciousness, devoid of any conscious perceptions and abilities. Then basic particles like protons, neutrons and electrons were created out of this basic energy, and they are likewise devoid of any consciousness, and their behavior is actually down to an intrinsic probabilism. That's a very important word in this essay, probabilism. So at the moment, scientists think that the basic stuff of our universe is non-conscious and probabilistic. Okay. So what do we mean by probabilistic? So that is to say that the behavior of the most basic elements of our universe is non-conscious and probabilistic. So for example, let's say we send an electron towards a screen. We can't say exactly where on the screen the electron will land. We can only say that there are certain probabilities of it landing at particular points on the screen. So there will be parts of the screen where the electron is more likely to land and parts where it's less likely to land. So the claim is that we live in a non-conscious, inherently probabilistic universe. Einstein hated this idea and thought it was definitely wrong, famously saying, God does not play dice. According to the conventional theory, how are we conscious? Well, supposedly these basic, non-conscious and probabilistic particles bonded together into more complex forms, such as atoms, molecules and cells, etc., and eventually into complex configurations such as brains, such as the human brain, for example, in or around which consciousness somehow discontinuously switches on. So somehow you take a group of these non-conscious particles, put them into the right configuration, such as a brain, a live brain, and consciousness somehow turns on, switches on. How the consciousness switches on, they have no idea. So the conventional theory does accept that consciousness exists, but they say that it came into existence sometime after t equals 0, after the Big Bang. My theory differs only by saying that consciousness came into existence at t equals 0, and that all physical energy and matter are conscious, are the physical manifestations of consciousness. Then the behavior of the basic particles observed in the experiments of quantum mechanics isn't due to some strange intrinsic probabilism, but due to the basic intrinsic consciousness of the particles. And since you have intrinsic consciousness and you're made of nothing but these particles, that makes sense. That solves the hard problem of consciousness. Okay, you will soon see how much more sense this theory makes out of 4 of the most famous experiments of quantum mechanics. Okay, I am repeating myself a little bit, but I just want to be absolutely clear. But first, how are you conscious according to my theory? So, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit. Well, all energy and matter are conscious. This energy and matter can take on different physical forms. This is obviously true. You are a different form of energy and matter than a tree, but you are both formed out of the same basic energy and protons, neutrons, and electrons. And according to my theory, each physical form is privately experiencing within itself its own corresponding form-dependent subjective conscious experience. So, for example, the exact configuration of energy and protons, neutrons, and electrons that you refer to as your body and brain is giving rise within yourself to exactly whatever private, subjective, conscious experience you're experiencing at this moment. A tree is a very different form of the basic energy and protons, neutrons, and electrons to a human, and as such also experiences a very different conscious experience than a human. But obviously a tree consciously enjoys sunlight, for example, and strives to move and grow towards the sun, a behavior we call phototropism. And obviously after a drought it will consciously enjoy the rain. Recent decades have produced a wide range of evidence of the consciousness of plants. So now you can understand how my theory very immediately solves the hard problem of consciousness. How are you and I conscious if all the energy and particles that we're made out of are totally devoid of consciousness? The answer is that the question is based on an incorrect assumption, namely that all the energy and particles are devoid of consciousness. When the truth is that you are conscious because all the energy and particles that you're made of are all conscious, which is why you can have conscious sensation of every part of your body, because your body is many different formations of conscious energy and matter, consciously connected together and centralized by your central nervous system. The truth is that conscious energy was born in the Big Bang, and then conscious particles were created out of this conscious energy, all possessing some very basic conscious perception of their local universe, as well as some basic conscious abilities. Then, these conscious particles bonded together into more complex configurations, like atoms and molecules and cells, all the way up to your good self. And conscious experience is form-dependent, so different physical configurations give rise to different private subjective conscious experiences within themselves. So, conscious protons, neutrons, and electrons in the form of your dog give rise to whatever conscious experience your dog is privy to, and formed into your exact physical self, they give rise to you and all your conscious experience. We can also say that the more similar two different configurations of conscious energy and matter are to one another, the more similar are their respective private conscious experiences within themselves. So, for example, you have more similar conscious experiences to another human than to a dog, because you are a more similar configuration of conscious energy and matter to a human than a dog. However, you still have a lot in common with a dog. a central nervous system, a brain, eyes, ears and nose, and a stomach, for example. So you share a lot of similar conscious experiences, such as hunger. This explains why you are able to know when your dog is hungry or happy or excited. Something like an earthworm is a much less similar configuration of conscious energy and matter, and as such, the private conscious experience of an earthworm is proportionally mysterious. All we can say with any confidence about an earthworm is that it has some conscious perception of its local environment, however basic and dim it may be in comparison to our human perception of our local environment, as well as the conscious ability to choose between future states to instantiate, such as to move in this direction or to move in that direction. We can observe an earthworm reacting to its local environment, as well as choosing between alternative behaviors. Then, something like a basic particle, an electron let's say, is an exceedingly less complex configuration of conscious energy than even an earthworm. As such, its conscious experience must be very basic indeed, certainly without any personality or reflective sense of ego, and inevitably somewhat mysterious to us as humans. So yeah, I am saying that basic particles are conscious, but that doesn't mean any sense of personality or any sense of self or able to reflect on their own nature or any linguistic ability at all. Just very basic, bare consciousness, conscious perception, and the ability to choose between different future states to instantiate, such as moving this way or moving that way, for example. Okay. However, as you will see in what follows, we only need to make a very few, very reasonable postulates about the nature of the consciousness of our universe to begin developing a true physics of consciousness. Of course, in this one essay I can't present a full and complete physics of consciousness. That will take some time, as well as the collaboration of other scientists. What I'm providing here is the basic principles and framework, the same way Isaac Newton provided the basic principles and framework for non-conscious objective physics. And remember, it took nearly 3 centuries after Newton until Newtonian physics could be considered complete, and Newton himself solved much less than 1% of all the problems that have subsequently been solved using Newtonian mechanics. Okay, so I've presented the theory of fundamental consciousness, and I've explained how it solves the hard problem of consciousness. But, as simple and obvious as my theory is, those qualities alone won't be enough to convince people it's true. So, to put things beyond all reasonable doubt, we will now finally use the postulate of fundamental consciousness to give the first simple and sensible interpretation of the until now famously confusing branch of physics known as quantum mechanics. You see, my theory, like all genuinely revolutionary scientific ideas, solves more than one problem or mystery. In this essay, we will confine ourselves to solving just the hard problem of consciousness as well as the mystery of quantum mechanics. In the next essay, I'll use the same principles to present the first conscious cosmological models of our universe. I'll give a more detailed explanation of the evolution of what we call life. I'll explain the essential difference between macro and microscopic physics, as well as discuss true free will versus the illusion of determinism. Yeah, next essay will have lots of interesting stuff in it. But now, this essay, and finally, quantum mechanics. So now we're going to reinterpret 4 famous experiments of quantum mechanics. But the whole of quantum mechanics can be interpreted in the same way. Okay. The postulate of fundamental consciousness. Capital E equals capital C. Energy is consciousness. Energy is conscious. Now, we know that every physical thing in our universe is formed out of energy via Einstein's E equals mc squared. A nuclear bomb, for example, converts matter back into energy according to this equation. So, If all energy is conscious, then all basic particles such as protons, neutrons and electrons, as well as all the atoms, molecules and cells, etc., formed out of these basic particles are also conscious. Thus, all quantum particles, such as electrons, etc., are conscious, and quantum mechanical experiments are the result of the conscious behavior of the observed particles. The conventional theory, the old theory, is that quantum behavior is due to an intrinsic probabilism, that these particles are non-conscious and their behavior is just inherently, intrinsically probabilistic. There is no explanation as to where this probabilism comes from. It is just considered intrinsic. And that's very strange, because everywhere else, in classical physics where we find probabilities, there's some physical mechanism for the probability. So flicking a coin can generate a probability distribution of heads and tails, but then you have a physical mechanism for the generation of the probability distribution, which is the flicking of the coin. But in quantum mechanics, it's just intrinsic. You can't observe any physical mechanism generating the probability distributions. Okay, so the probabilism is just considered intrinsic. This is very strange. Einstein didn't like it at all, famously saying God does not play dice. And of course, it immediately begs the question, how are we conscious and why aren't we non-conscious and probabilistic if everything we're made out of is non-conscious and probabilistic? So I am simply changing this intrinsic probabilism to intrinsic consciousness. This is the one and only change to the conventional theory we are going to make. None of the mathematics used to describe the geometries of the various experiments, that is the geometrical distributions of large numbers of particles, none of that maths needs to be changed at all, because I'm not at all denying any of the experimental results of quantum mechanics. I'm just saying that these experimental results are being generated by an intrinsic, unobservable consciousness and not by an intrinsic, unobservable probabilism. And this intrinsic consciousness makes much more sense, since you are made out of nothing but these particles and you are conscious. Not only that, but the fact that, and this is very important, but the fact that quantum mechanics forced physicists to use probabilistic maths is actually evidence in favor of my theory, since as we know from the sciences of economics and psychology, you are forced to use probabilistic mathematics to describe large numbers of individual conscious entities making individual conscious choices between limited sets of alternatives. And then you can't use deterministic maths. Quantum mechanical experiments exhibit the behaviors of individual particles, such as electrons, large numbers of individual particles, such as electrons, making conscious choices between limited sets of alternatives, which is why they require a probabilistic mathematical treatment, just like economics and psychology, which are also the studies of large numbers of conscious individuals choosing between limited sets of future alternatives. So that's why quantum mechanics forced physicists who they were accustomed to using deterministic mathematics, because macroscopic physics, big things, macroscopic physics, classical physics, Newtonian physics uses deterministic maths. But because quantum mechanics is exhibiting individual conscious entities making conscious choices between limited sets of future states, it forced physicists to use probabilistic mathematics. Okay, let's move on. So, all quantum particles are conscious entities. Now, by the law of privacy of consciousness, we can never directly, objectively observe quantum particles' consciousness. However, based on our own experience of being conscious entities, as well as our careful observation of other conscious entities, we can identify the most fundamental properties of consciousness common to all conscious entities. Thus, here are the two universal properties of all conscious entities with which we can interpret all of quantum mechanics. So, 1. All conscious entities possess some conscious perception of their local environment. Okay, so just like you possess conscious perception of your local environment, you don't possess conscious perception of the whole universe. You possess conscious perception of only the parts of the universe closest to you. So that's your local environment. So consciousness is a local phenomenon. And the second ability possessed by all conscious entities is the ability to choose between limited sets of future states to instantiate. Okay, so you spend all day doing this. You choose between limited sets of things to do or what have you. With these two simple and reasonable postulates, we can finally give the correct interpretation of quantum mechanics. Again, I point out that this way of interpreting quantum mechanics is not all that radical a departure from the conventional canonical interpretation as taught in every official physics department in the world. In the conventional interpretation, quantum entities or systems do make selections from limited sets of future states to instantiate. It's just that the selection is made purely probabilistically due to some intrinsic, unobservable probabilism. Some of these sentences are pretty torturous, but I want to be accurate. We are now simply changing this intrinsic probabilism to intrinsic consciousness. So in technical language, we'll say, technically, the selection from limited sets of possible future states is known as the collapse of the wave function. The conventional interpretation of quantum mechanics says that the collapse of the wave function is an intrinsically probabilistic process. I'm changing this to, and you can guess, I'm changing this to the collapse of the wave function is an intrinsically conscious act. So a quantum entity, like an electron, has some very basic conscious perception of its local environment. And under certain conditions, and particularly under certain well-defined and repeatable experimental conditions, the nature of its local environment presents the conscious entity with a limited set of possible future states from which it can choose to instantiate. This theory becomes eminently plausible when you compare it to your own lifetime of experience as a conscious entity. Do you not have some limited conscious perception of your local environment? Yes. Look around you. Listen to my voice. Do you not have the conscious ability to choose between limited sets of future behaviors to instantiate? Yes. You can consciously choose to like, share, and subscribe, or you can consciously choose to not like, share, and subscribe. And you possess these conscious properties and abilities because they are intrinsic to every particle composing your body and brain. When basic conscious particles bond together, the new, more complex formations also possess the same basic conscious properties and abilities common to all its constituents. So you are conscious for the same reason you have mass. You have mass because all the particles you're made of have mass. And similarly, you're conscious because all the particles you're made out of are conscious. Okay, now we reinterpret 4 famous experiments of quantum mechanics, postulating only the 2 universal properties of conscious entities. So, to repeat, all conscious entities have 1, some conscious perception of their local environment. All conscious entities have also the ability to choose between limited sets of future states to instantiate. I will give the conventional interpretations followed by my conscious interpretations, so you can see how much more sense my interpretations make. We begin with the most famous experiment of quantum mechanics. I'm sure you've heard of this experiment. The two-slit experiment. This is the quintessential quantum experiment and the most striking example of what's known as wave-particle duality. I'm sure you've heard of wave-particle duality before. It's very famous. Joe Rogan has had lots of guests on explaining it. Well, wave-particle duality is the name of a physical ability possessed by the smallest and most basic physical entities of our universe. The microscopic particles, atoms, and even molecules of our universe are capable of behaving as particles and as waves. Not at the same time, but as you observe an electron, let's say, in certain experiments at certain points in the same experiment, it exists in the form of a wave, and at other points it exists as a particle. Okay, that's wave-particle duality. When physicists first observed this phenomenon, they were extremely shocked. They didn't know how to understand or interpret this behavior for a long time, until a great physicist called Niels Bohr came up with the Copernican interpretation, which says that the behavior of these particles is due to an intrinsic probabilism. Einstein was convinced this was wrong. Even Niels Bohr himself didn't find it satisfying and could understand why Einstein didn't like it, but he couldn't see any other possibility. Einstein said God does not play dice, by which he meant our universe is definitely not intrinsically probabilistic. And Niels Bohr replied, Einstein, stop telling God what to do, meaning that we don't get to tell the universe how she is, rather it's the other way around. Of course, neither of them considered my theory, because the idea that basic energy and matter are non-conscious was far too deeply ingrained in the scientific psyche for such ideas to ever occur to them. Although Max Planck, the very first quantum mechanic, and Erwin Schrödinger, who formulated wave mechanics, did both think that consciousness is fundamental to all physics, just as I'm saying. The very first quantum physicist, Max Planck, said, and I quote, I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative of consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness. And Erwin Schrödinger, who single-handedly formulated quantum wave mechanics, said, consciousness cannot be accounted for in physical terms, for consciousness is absolutely fundamental. It cannot be accounted for in terms of anything else. Okay, so Max Planck and Erwin Schrödinger, two of the most famous quantum physicists, both very explicitly endorse my theory. Okay, so in the two-slit experiment, a particle or atom or molecule is sent through two slits. From now on, we'll say electrons. And after passing through the two slits, the electron lands on a screen placed beyond the slits. Now, before quantum mechanics, an electron was believed to be just a particle, and therefore it was assumed that it could only pass through one slit at a time. However, when we send large numbers of electrons through the slits, one after another, and we can wait as long as we want between sending each electron, so we know that the electrons aren't interfering with one another. When we send large numbers of electrons through the two slits, they land on the screen behind the slits, forming a very distinctive pattern, known as an interference pattern. Now, interference patterns are made by waves, light waves, sound waves, or water waves, for example. So the only way to explain the electrons forming an interference pattern is to suppose that on leaving its source, each electron travels as a wave towards and through the two slits, before collapsing back into a particle at the screen. So it can be a wave as it travels through space, and then once it reaches the screen, it collapses back into a particle. Thus, an electron can be a wave and a particle at different points in time in the same experiment. So the electron leaves its source and travels as a wave towards and through the two slits. do try and visualize what's going on here as best you can. Maybe think of a wave in the sea or a small wave in a pond. Now imagine this single electron wave passing through two adjacent slits in a barrier. The two slits will split the electron wave into two smaller waves, one emanating from each of the two slits. Then these two wave fronts, as they're known, will interact with one another before reaching the screen. Now, think of a wave as an S, the letter S, the shape of the letter S, but lying on its side. So it has one high part and one low part, or one peak and one trough. That's the technical language in physics. Now imagine two water waves. If the two peaks, so the peaks are the high part, obviously, bump into one another, then they will form one bigger peak, twice the size of one of the original peaks. This is called constructive interference. The wave gets bigger. And if a peak meets a trough, the size of the peak will be decreased by falling into the trough. Then the peak and the trough will kind of cancel each other out. And if two troughs bump into each other, they will form an even lower trough. Now, when two wave fronts encounter each other, where the resulting wave gets bigger than the original peaks, it's known as constructive interference, and when it gets smaller, it's known as destructive interference. Then, if we do this with light waves, we use two slits to split a light wave into two wave fronts. The peaks and troughs of the two new wave fronts will bump into each other, creating constructive and destructive interference at different points. Then on a screen beyond the two slits, we will observe a pattern of bands, so strips of light of increased brightness next to bands of decreased brightness, corresponding to constructive and destructive interference. So in some places two peaks of light meet and then the light gets brighter. In other places a peak and a trough meet and they kind of cancel each other out, or two troughs can meet and you get much less light. Now in the case of electrons, we see the same pattern. Okay, but it's made up of groupings of electrons instead of light. So there are bands where lots of electrons land on the screen and bands where no electrons land, corresponding to constructive and destructive interference of the electron wave, proving that individual electrons travel through both slits as a wave. Okay, so that's conventional quantum mechanics, wave-particle duality. And particles behaving sometimes as waves. Now, conventionally, this wave has been interpreted as being probabilistic. This is what I'm going to change, which is to say that the magnitude or size of the wave at any point is proportional to the probability of the electron landing at a corresponding point on the screen beyond the slits. Technically, the probability is proportional to the squared modulus of the electron wave, but that doesn't affect our argument. Those are just mathematical terms when you're carrying out the actual mathematics. But anyway, the electron becomes a wave, and the wave is a measure of probability. So if as a part of the wave reaches the screen, the electron wave, it has a large magnitude. If it has a large magnitude due to constructive interference, then there is a proportionally high probability of the electron wave collapsing back into an electron particle at that point on the screen. So if you send a large number of electrons through the screen, a lot of them group in bands where their electron waves have greater magnitude, and at points on the screen where the destructive interference has reduced the magnitude of the electron wave to zero, the probability of electrons landing at these points is likewise zero, and no electrons are ever observed to land at these points. So conventionally, the electron wave has been associated with probability. Where the electron wave has greater magnitude, the greater the probability of the electron landing at the corresponding point on the screen. Thus, basic particles have been thought to be non-conscious, and their behavior to be intrinsically probabilistic. None of the founding fathers of quantum mechanics were happy with this interpretation. It creates a lot of logical problems, the most glaring of which is how are we conscious and capable of conscious choice if everything that we're formed out of is non-conscious and behaves due to some inherent probabilism? A full century after the advent of quantum mechanics, and scientists are no closer to any remotely comprehensible theory that resolves this dilemma. My theory makes much more sense. In my theory, the electron wave isn't a measure of some intrinsic probabilism, but rather a measure of the electron's intrinsic conscious perception of its local environment. So, an electron is emitted from a source, and as a wave of an electron is emitted from a source as a wave of conscious perception. This wave travels through the two slits and it interferes with itself in the way I've just explained. Then, the reason the electron never lands at points on the screen where its wave has zero magnitude is because the electron has zero conscious perception of these areas. And no conscious entity will ever head into areas of its environment of which it has no conscious perception. You yourself tend to choose to walk in light rather than darkness. Electrons tend to crowd in areas where the wave has greater magnitude because these are areas of which the electrons have greater conscious perception. In essence, when an electron becomes a wave, it becomes an energetic wave of conscious perception by which it perceives or sees its local environment. And in the same way a car travels in the same direction as its headlights are shining, electrons head in the direction of their own light of conscious perception. Thus we have explained the two-slit experiment simply by postulating the electrons having some basic conscious perception of their local environment, particularly the screen as they approach it, as well as the ability to choose between limited sets of future states. In this case, the electron itself chooses exactly which point on the screen to land. Okay. The bat experiment. Okay, here is one simple testable hypothesis I have to corroborate my theory. It's called the bat experiment. The interference pattern observed in the two-slit experiment is considered the quintessential experiment, the hallmark of quantum mechanics. Thus, if we observe interference patterns being generated by entities that we already know are conscious, it makes the claim that quantum interference patterns are the result of consciousness much more plausible. Bats use echolocation to navigate their local environment. That is, they use sound waves to visualize their local surroundings. If these sound waves pass through two slits of the same magnitude as their wavelength, they will interfere in the normal way, creating an interference pattern. So, if we send bats whose echolocating sound waves are of the same magnitude as their bodies through slit architecture, they will experience gaps in their perception corresponding to areas of destructive interference. And of course, the bats won't move into areas of which they have no perception. Thus, the bats will create an interference pattern on a net placed an appropriate distance behind the slits, proving that interference patterns are the result of conscious behavior. This experiment has actually already been verified, since bats are already known to experience perceptual blindness due to interference effects in their echolocation. For all the probabilistic interpretations of quantum mechanics, there is a simple conscious interpretation. There are many similar experiments like this that draw analogies between quantum mechanics and behavior known to be conscious. This is why quantum mechanics compelled physicists to use probabilistic maths, because free conscious choice can't be described using deterministic maths, but requires a probabilistic description, as we already know from the study of psychology and economics. Okay, next we will interpret another famous experiment of quantum mechanics known as the Stern-Gerlach apparatus. A Stern-Gerlach apparatus, these are strange German names, two German people I think, Stern and Gerlach. A Stern-Gerlach apparatus is an apparatus that creates a magnetic field in a well-defined direction. All electrons possess what is known as spin, which basically means that all electrons are like little magnets. Now, when an electron enters the magnetic field in the Stern-Gerlach apparatus, it always aligns such that its magnetic moment, or its spin, is pointing in one of only two directions, either pointing in exactly the same direction as the magnetic field, or else in exactly the opposite direction. Or in technical language, we say that the electron aligns, either spin up or spin down, in the magnetic field. Now, if the electron enters the magnetic field with its magnetic moment or spin already pointing halfway between spin up and spin down, then 50% of the time it will align spin up and 50% of the time spin down. If it enters the magnetic field with its spin already inclined more towards one of the two directions, spin up or spin down, then it will be more likely to align in this direction. But it will still align in the other direction some percentage of the time. So that's the experiment. Traditionally, this has been explained by intrinsic probabilism. That is, it's said that electrons create these spin-state distributions in the Stern-Gerlach apparatus because they are intrinsically probabilistic entities. Based on the preceding interpretation of the two-slit experiment, you've probably already worked out how to interpret the Stern-Gerlach experiment using fundamental consciousness. If you haven't, then maybe pause the video and see if you can work it out, if you like. Or you can just listen to me. Okay, my interpretation of the Stern-Gerlach experiment. An electron is both a conscious as well as a magnetic entity. So it's conscious as well. Thus, on entering a magnetic field, an electron has some conscious sensation or perception of the magnetic field surrounding it. Being in the magnetic field is a different conscious experience or sensation for an electron than being in free space. You yourself probably know what it consciously feels like to be within an electric field. If it's strong enough, your hair will stand on end. So, the electron can consciously sense being in a magnetic field like you can consciously sense being in an electric field. Thus, an electron in a Stern-Gerlach apparatus has some conscious sensation of entering the magnetic field within the apparatus, that due to its magnetic properties forces it to choose between aligning itself spin up or spin down with respect to the field. Since space is isotropic, that means it's the same in any direction, there is no physical or conscious difference between the two alternatives, spin up or spin down. Hence the 50-50 probability distribution generated by large numbers of electrons entering the apparatus perpendicular to the magnetic field. Conscious humans or any animals also produce a 50-50 split when they have two identical alternatives to choose from. If an electron enters the field with their spin already aligned at an angle closer to one of the directions spin up or spin down, then it is more likely to align its spin in that direction. However, some percentage of the electrons will still choose to align in the other direction, which is evidence of the intrinsic free will of electrons and other quantum entities. You yourself possess the same basic conscious free will. For example, hold your thumb out horizontal to the ground, then choose to either put your thumb up or down. You just exercise the same basic free will an electron does in a Stern-Gerlach apparatus. Or another analogy is, you walk into a room, there are two chairs, and you can choose which chair to sit down. Now, if the chairs are identical and they're an equal distance apart, they're both the same distance away from you, Humans walking into that room, 50% of the time they'll choose one chair and 50% another. However, if they walk in and one chair is significantly closer, they'll be more likely to choose to sit down in the closer chair. Although some percentage of the time, the person will still decide to choose in the chair that's far away. That's just free will, intrinsic free will. Okay. The pleasure-pain principle. The pleasure-pain principle. The Stern-Gerlach experiment suggests a simple way of beginning the development of conscious cosmologies. By analogy with our own experience as conscious entities, we can postulate that all conscious entities always attempt to maximize comfort and pleasure and to minimize discomfort and pain. The behavior of every organism on the planet is a manifestation of this principle. It is intrinsic to all life. It is therefore reasonable to postulate that it is also intrinsic to all the particles out of which life is formed. An electron is a magnetic entity. As such, its conscious experience of being within a magnetic field is different to that of being in free space. We know that an electron has intrinsic spin, that it always aligns either parallel or anti-parallel with respect to a magnetic field. This can be logically explained by supposing that these two alignments both minimize the amount of pain or maximize the amount of pleasure experienced by an electron in a magnetic field. That the larger the perpendicular component of spin the electron projects into the magnetic field, the more discomfort or pain or less pleasure the electron consciously experiences. Then, as a creature familiar with conscious pain and pleasure, you can immediately understand the electron's behavior. All electrons immediately align themselves parallel or anti-parallel with the magnetic field, the same way all humans immediately pull their hands off of hot stoves. It is possible to use a simple pleasure-pain principle as the basis of a conscious cosmology to explain the processes of cosmic evolution that have culminated locally in humans and their much expanded range of pleasurable and painful experiences. So I'll go into more detail in terms of conscious cosmologies in the next essay. Okay, Stern-Gerlach completed. Next experiment, only 2 more to go. Quantum tunneling, you've probably heard of that one as well. Okay, the conventional interpretation of quantum tunneling. A particle encounters a potential barrier shallow enough that it is capable of tunneling through it. So if the potential barrier isn't too high, particles can tunnel through the potential barrier. Which is to say that it is capable of the quantum mechanical action of suddenly appearing on the other side of the potential barrier. Whether or not the particle does tunnel through the barrier, as well as the exact moment it tunnels, are considered traditionally to be inherently probabilistic events. We can only assign probabilities as to whether a particular particle will tunnel within a certain period of time. My conscious interpretation. A quantum particle has some conscious perception of a nearby potential barrier. Remember, consciousness is local, so the particle can't perceive all barriers, it can only perceive potential barriers nearby. If the barrier is small enough, the particle can consciously choose to tunnel through the barrier. If the barrier is too steep, the particle isn't capable of making this choice. Whether and exactly when the particle decides to tunnel are conscious choices made by the particle. There is an obvious analogy here to a human encountering a wall. If the wall isn't too high, the human may or may not decide to jump over it, which leads us nicely to our next experiment. The rabbit experiment. This experiment, like the bat experiment, draws an analogy between the behavior of a quantum entity and the behavior of a macroscopic entity we know to be conscious. As the physics of consciousness develops, many more such analogies will be described. Okay, so rabbits are sent down a passageway in which they encounter a barrier. When this experiment is repeated a large number of times, we will observe that some measurable percentage of the time a rabbit encounters the barrier, it will choose to hop over it, and some percentage of the time it will turn back from the barrier. As we raise the height of the barrier, we will find that the percentage of the time the rabbit chooses to hop over the barrier will decrease. And once the barrier approaches some measurable critical height, the percentage of time a rabbit chooses to hop over the barrier will go to 0. We can then write a mathematical wave function to describe this behavior. Different species of rabbit will have different wave functions with different critical heights depending on the size and jumping power of the species in question. The analogy here to quantum tunneling experiments is very exact. It's also important to note that some alien species, sufficiently different from rabbits, such that they don't recognize them as conscious beings, on studying this behavior in rabbits, might conclude that rabbits are inherently probabilistic entities, thus making the same mistake human physicists have made over the last 100 years studying quantum particles. Okay, the final experiment. Muon decay. A muon is a type of particle. Okay, a muon is a particle that decays, that means breaks up. It breaks up or decays into a number of smaller particles. Conventionally, this decay process is considered probabilistic, so we can't predict exactly when a muon will decay. We can only assign a probability to it decaying within some period of time. Okay, my conscious interpretation. Due to its physical nature and construction, a muon undergoes decay under certain physical conditions. Under such conditions, the muon has some conscious sensation of its need to decay, and the muon itself decides exactly when to decay. A very loose analogy to human behavior would be to a woman giving birth. Physical conditions, and to repeat, this is a very loose analogy. Physical conditions within and around the woman are going to force her to give birth. But she makes a conscious choice as to when exactly to start pushing. Muons decay after an average of 2.2 microseconds. Pregnant human females decay after an average of 9 months. Please don't take this analogy too literally. I don't mean to imply any personality or reflective sense of ego within the muon, rather just some basic consciousness, including the ability to choose exactly when to decay. Okay, so I just reinterpreted 4 very famous quantum mechanical experiments. And the whole of quantum mechanics can be similarly interpreted. Just anywhere there's a wave function, instead of the wave function representing a probabilistic selection of future states, it's actually a conscious selection of future states, because all these basic particles possess basic consciousness. Okay, conclusion, finally. The future of physics. Humans are conscious and capable of consciously observing and describing their universe around them. They have been very successful describing the universe objectively. That is, the geometric structures that energy and matter can take on, and how they evolve physically as well as their motions through space. However, they have totally failed to give any scientific description or account of their own conscious experience. This is because they have traditionally assumed a priori that the basic energy and particles of our universe are devoid of any consciousness, and then completely failed to come up with any reasonable theory as to how consciousness discontinuously switches on around special configurations of these non-conscious constituents. But then quantum mechanics came along and forced the physicists to resort to using probabilistic maths to describe the behavior of the basic particles of our universe. Then, there are two and only two ways to explain this. Either one, the basic particles are inherently probabilistic and non-conscious. This is what has been assumed to date, but it doesn't make any sense, as the founding fathers of quantum mechanics openly and famously admitted. It leads immediately to the logical problem of how are we conscious and capable of making conscious choices if everything we're made out of is non-conscious and inherently probabilistic. After a century of trying to resolve this mystery, it remains pristine. Why? Because it's logically impossible to resolve. So, we're left with the only other logical possibility. Possibility 2. The probabilistic mathematics of quantum mechanics is actually evidence that quantum experiments are highlighting individual particles making very simple and basic conscious choices. As we know from the sciences of economics and psychology, when a system involves large numbers of conscious entities making individual choices, we are forced to resort to a probabilistic mathematical description, just as in quantum mechanics. Now, finally, we can construct a sensible theory of our own existence as conscious beings. Energy came into existence in the Big Bang, and this energy is conscious. Is in fact physical consciousness. Then, conscious particles formed out of this conscious energy, as described objectively by conventional physics. Then these particles, such as electrons, are conscious. They possess some limited conscious perception of their local environment, as well as the ability to choose between limited sets of possible future states to instantiate, such as choosing between aligning spin up or spin down within a magnetic field, for example. Now, do you not have some limited conscious perception of your local environment? Yes. You're consciously hearing my words. Can you not consciously choose from limited sets of future alternatives to instantiate? Yes. Yes, you can. You can choose to like, share, and subscribe, or not to like, share, and subscribe. You possess these conscious abilities because they are intrinsic to every particle of which you are formed. And you possess a much wider and more varied range of such conscious abilities because you are a vastly more complex configuration of conscious energy that has taken billions of years to evolve. Conscious energy came into existence in the Big Bang. It is capable of taking on many different forms, and within each physical form is its own private, subjective conscious experience. You yourself are one particular physical form of this conscious energy, and within you at any given moment is your own private, subjective conscious experience. Science evolves by way of expansion. Einstein expanded Newtonian physics into relativistic and non-Euclidean geometries. Conventional physics until now is an approximation to a larger and truer conscious picture of our universe, where the approximation being unwittingly made is that of setting consciousness equal to zero. I am expanding physics by dealing with consciousness the only way it can be dealt with, which is as a fundamental a priori phenomenon. E equals C, capital E equals capital C, energy equals consciousness. Conventional objective physics has provided us with a mathematical description or mapping of the physical forms of our universe, as well as their physical evolution and their motions through space. The work of subjective physics is to deduce the different types of form-dependent conscious experience that exist within the physical forms. This is easier for us the more similar a particular form is to the human form. So, for example, a dog has a brain, central nervous system, stomach, etc. So we can know by analogy with our own conscious bodies and conscious experiences that these physical forms give rise to the conscious sensations of hunger and satiety within the dog, for example. Similarly, we know a dog has binocular visual conscious experience. and we can examine the physical structure of its eyes to deduce exactly what range of colors it can perceive. Quantum entities, on the other hand, are such different forms of conscious energy and matter to humans that it has taken a full century for us to finally recognize them as conscious. The theory of fundamental consciousness simply and logically explains quantum mechanics, as well as immediately solving the hard problem of consciousness by removing the logical impasse of a discontinuous switching on of consciousness around non-conscious constituents. Yes, it is a revolutionary theory, but it's a loud motorbike. Yes, it is a revolutionary theory, but it is not illogical or woo-woo. It is simple and intuitive, and like all revolutionary scientific ideas, it solves more than one existing mystery. It does take some time to get used to the fact that everything around you is conscious. But it doesn't mean you have to worry that your chair is conscious or anything silly like that. It just means that all the quantum decisions involved in being a chair are being decided by the constituent particles' inherent consciousness instead of by an inherent probabilism. A chair has no personality or reflective sense of self. It's far too simple a configuration of conscious energy to possess such conscious perceptions and abilities. Something like an electron has even less of a sense of self than an amoeba. It just exists, making choices between very simple sets of alternative future states as its surrounding universe presents them. You are already accustomed to believing that all the people and animals and even plants around you are conscious. I'm just expanding this set of conscious entities to include the basic particles of our universe. And through the various processes of evolution, these basic particles have bonded together into forms of ever-increasing complexity, up to and including conscious humans and yourself. A form so complex and intelligent that it is capable of observing, studying, and describing the characteristics and behaviors of the less complex forms around it, such as animals and plants, and now even the basic particles and atoms of our universe. And if physics has taught us one thing, it's that our universe will always surprise us. Einstein showed that a train shrinks in length along the direction it's travelling when observed from outside the train, and that two twins can age at different rates depending on their relative velocity. So, surprise, the whole universe is conscious. It's nothing but conscious energy taking on different forms, from strings, quarks and waves, protons, neutrons and electrons, atoms, molecules, cells, dinosaurs, dolphins and apes, and even me and you. And you are, in fact, a conscious vibration in the mind of our universe, the one true God, whose latest appellation is love. HBFF. All the best. Thank you for listening. All the best. Sincerely, Sol Solaire. Goodbye.